Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It seems that my panel is getting thinner, but I'm glad to know that so many people do watch either on live stream on YouTube or during the week. Usually I see about 250 people reading or hearing parts of these talks. So I think that that's a good sign. And so tonight I will be continuing with this book, two essays on the analytical psychology. And we're in the second part of the book where we're discussing relations between the ego and the unconscious, the assimilation of the unconscious. And so since I seem to be alone here, I'm just going to go ahead and proceed for a period of time, and hopefully some of my sidekicks will join me. And you're urged to join me as well. And let me just make sure I give you the link for that. We have a MailChimp list where you can be on the list for the panel. And if you sign up for that, I send you a reminder every week of when we are starting. And And so I send you a regular reminder, and then you join. And fortunately, Jordan, my frequent sidekick, is here. And so there he is. Good evening,
hey,
Jordan. How are you doing?
Good. I have no idea where my headphones are.
Okay.
Oh, they're in the wrong drawer.
Well, that'll do it. And so I've just been sort of freebooting it for the moment, just saying that we'd like to have some more panelists to discuss these issues. We don't mind responding to YouTube chat, but it's also nice to have people in the panel to discuss things. How are you doing since yesterday?
Amazing, honestly. I just signed a lease for the plaza, and I thought it was $1,000 a month, and because that's what she had mentioned last year. And she goes, I think our trial by subscription is over. All the shop owners love you. And so she said, so you want to sign a lease? And I said, well, it's $1,000 a month, which is doable, but she goes, where'd you get that? It's $1,000 a year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I said, I'm thinking that's legal theft. And I realized she never said $1,000 a month when she said $1,000 last year. My real estate brain put month because of triple net or 90 day. I mean, our monthly. I would never put $1,000 on a lease for a year. So I had gone over just to meet with her to set up my spot and get back in the swing later this week, and ended up signing a lease. It's like, oh, I'll bring you a cashier's check tomorrow. I mean,
yeah, man.
So
amen.
Thank you. It's like the lowest overhead for real estate I think I've ever had. Actually, seen.
You probably can cover that with one day of readings.
I was going to say it's like $80-some a month. That'll be the first two readings. It's covered. It's like the first 2.5 hours and it's done.
Right. Well, that's very nice to have that kind of a situation.
Yeah, I felt pretty blessed. I was surprised because like, can I buy you a cup of coffee? She's like, no, I'll get it. What do you want? And then she pulls the lease out, and then we started talking. And I don't know if I've been that almost speechless for a couple of seconds, and I don't know how long.
Well, that's good news. I mean, even at 1,000 a month, it sounded doable.
Yeah, that's what I'm. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I've never heard. I mean, and I was thinking about doing farmers market, and it's 560 for the season, but it's only 4.5 hours every Saturday. That's like half a day,
Yeah,
once a week. And I'm like, I'll make it up in several weeks. But
and you're going to produce a product for farmers market.
I do readings there.
Or do readings.
And so I can sell decks, but I'm not going to now because I'm like that. And I mentioned it to her. She goes, "Yeah, don't worry about that. They always come over here afterwards anyway." Because and I realized the farmers market is 2 blocks away from this part of the plaza, so there's no reason to go to there for half a day and then go to the other place anyway.
Right.
So
right. Okay.
Is it just us tonight, or?
So far, Jewel said she's not feeling well and so won't be here.
Oh no.
And I'm hoping that Annabelle will join us later, perhaps, and some of the others. But who knows? We can just blast away at it and see where it goes.
Sounds good.
I just got hit by a big grocery order that, whoa. Yeah. Deb and I can no longer carry all this stuff up the stairs. You know, we have 16 steps to our apartment, and that's a little more than we can handle with
bags of groceries. Yeah.
Big, lots of bags of groceries. Just think of the whole of I don't know, an SUV or a station wagon filled with bags and 2 old septuagenarians trying to get that stuff in. It's not fun.
It's like Instacart kind of stuff, or the grocery ordering.
Well,
or the grocery stores themselves have
the grocery store itself, which is giant, has a delivery service, and it's quite good. And
nice.
We just tip it $20 a week or so, or every 10 days. I guess Deb's putting in an order. It works out pretty well. I mean, sometimes we have to go in and get something else, but anyway. So this gets a little bit fun. I propose that we break down this first paragraph. It's quite long, and the first half of it seems to cover the basics, and then the second half is more experiential. So let me begin with paragraph 236, and we're reading from 2 essays on analytical psychology by C.G. Jung. It's volume 7 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. So 236, and this is from a part of the book called The Assimilation of the Unconscious. So this is the trials and tribulations of assimilating your unconscious. By raising the personal unconscious to consciousness, the analysis makes the subject aware of things which he is generally aware of in others, but never in himself. This discovery makes him therefore less individually unique and more collective. His collectivization is not always a step to the bad. It may sometimes be a step to the good. There are people who repress their good qualities and consciously give free rein to their infantile desires. You think? the lifting of
Never seen that.
The lifting of personal repressions at first brings purely personal contents into consciousness, but attached to them are the collective elements of the unconscious, the ever-present instincts, qualities, and ideas, images, as well as all those statistical quotas of average virtue and average vice, which we recognize when we say everyone has in him something of the criminal, the genius, and the saint. Thus, a living picture emerges containing pretty well everything that moves upon the checkerboard of the world, the good and the bad, the fair and the foul. A sense of solidarity with the world is gradually built up, which is felt by many natures as something very positive, and in certain cases actually is the deciding factor in the treatment of neurosis. Okay, this is interesting because this is in part the essence of the play that we're working on for our program in the summer, called The Analyst and the Rabbi, in which things that Dr. Jung hadn't wanted to remember or think of were brought up by the rabbi, and Jung is required to confess all of it. And so,
Right.
I'm playing Dr. Jung in this play, and I joke that I'm having to eat Jung's entire shadow in this play. That's my task, because we're not really getting into any of his teachings of his books. We're really getting into, what he did in World War II or before World War II, let's say, and how that impacted his reputation later. But anyway, comments on this first half?
Well, yeah, the one thing that comes to mind, I love the criminal, the genius, the saint. And what's interesting this week, I'll go back. It seems like every week I feel like I'm becoming Annabelle. Every week I have this beautiful synchronicity of something I see that then applies to what we read. Then I haven't read it yet. And part of that's, the capital S self working around through Jung's text. But the checkerboard upon which we each move upon, when that's mentioned. This week I saw this cartoon, and it was Queen Elizabeth, and she was standing at the edges, 2 foot by 2 foot square black and white checkerboard floor, and the caption is, "Be careful, she can move in any direction." It's like just like chess, the queen on the moving, stepping onto this checkerboard floor. So I was like, be careful, she can move in any direction. And that then kind of applies to, how do we move into our genius, our criminal, our saint?
Right.
What parts do we evolve or cut? How do we garden the current genius, the saint? And I think that checkerboard is interesting, where you can move in any direction. We're each, that leader, as it were, of ourselves. And she has such a generous heart way about her. And it's not even, there's no dictator in the benevolent. I mean, it's not a benevolent dictator. She really exudes royalty, and in the way I think that's real and good and true and honest and substantial. She's not, just trying to put.
She's definitely a woman of substance. There's no question about that.
When she speaks, like when she gave that speech earlier this year, I mean, I was just rapt listening, because this is a human being the way they're supposed to be made, and that made herself, driving Jeeps in the war, and
she's been through a hell of a lot in her lifetime.
Yes.
Even though she's also been protected, but even this week, William and Catherine were in the Caribbean, and they were having problems. I don't know if you saw that.
I didn't see that.
Well, they were making a state visit, and oh, by the way, the Caribbean islanders want their independence. They want to be republics, and they're still under British rule. And,
oh, wow.
And so, there's still a few of those around that have to be, worked out, right? Because even as we know from Miles, even Canada is still in the Commonwealth of Nations, and the head of state for Canada is actually the Queen of England, and most people are not aware of that. And
well, it's interesting when people say, can you name all the countries that have been invaded or taken over by England? And my response is always, well, the shorter list is much easier of those who haven't.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And I couldn't tell you the list, but it's much shorter. How about I work on that instead? I don't like the other homework. It's like every country there ever been.
Yeah, and before that, it was the Dutch.
Right.
Before the British, it was the Dutch. And I don't know how Britain got this upper hand, because there were 3 Anglo-Dutch wars during the 17th century. And if I remember correctly, at least 2 of them were won by the Dutch, and I think all 3 of them may have been. And it was the Dutch that were the sea power in the 17th century. And so when you go in the Rijksmuseum in Netherlands, there are huge paintings of ships and battles, and I always rue the day that the Dutch, in settling the 1657 Second Anglo-Dutch War, made a little bit of a mistake, we could say, which was that they traded Manhattan, which they had originally owned and owned for at least 30, 40 years before that. And the Dutch West India Company was running the place, New Amsterdam at that time. But they traded Manhattan Island for Suriname. And today, about half of the Dutch soccer team, football team, comes from Suriname. And I think it's 20% or so of the Dutch population comes from Suriname. And so why would you, here's Stump the Stars question, why would you trade Manhattan for Suriname?
Well, I think I'd have to kind of start an answer without finishing it, that back then it probably made plenty of sense. But if you look long-term from an investing standpoint, obviously not a good idea. Manhattan's worth a little bit more than Suriname.
Right.
So,
but
I mean, it's,
and
maybe they're looking at potential.
You have to look at it from a 17th century Dutchman's point of view. Suriname had all the spices, and the Dutch had a spice trade going out to Java and Sumatra in Asia. But that was a long ride. That was a long haul. I mean, you could make that trip once a year in a sailing ship. You made it once a year. And so the Dutch weren't terribly visionary. And so, for example, they kept their colony in Cape Town quite small for a couple hundred years, like under 200 people for like 200 years intentionally. And if somebody in the colony wanted to get married, they had to write back to the Lord 17 in Amsterdam and say, can we get married?
Yeah.
It was that bad. And my aunts and sisters were 5 of the first 150 settlers of Manhattan, but they didn't care much for the company either. So they became farmers, and they had some very large farms, and they ultimately founded four New York cities, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Albany, and Rensselaer were all founded by my first European American ancestor. And they lived up there near Albany in a group of 12 people among the Iroquois nation for centuries, until, let's see, they went up there in the 1640s, and they were still up there in the early 1800s. And then they came across to the Syracuse area. But anyway, that we digress. So,
actually, I think there's a piece there. I think that the Manhattan versus Suriname is almost the exact reverse of the deal that Benjamin Franklin coined, for lack of a better word, of I'm going to put $200 in these two bank accounts and you can't touch them for 200 years, and then of course they're worth, a couple million or more or what have you, which is the exact reverse, because he was basically, here's your $200 Manhattan, but it's going to turn into Manhattan, and it's going to take a couple hundred years, that whole bet. And it kind of brings me into the paragraph where it says there are people who repress their good qualities and consciously give free rein in their infantile desires. There's kind of a quick fixes have shallow roots or adolescent piece in that, or the opposite of put $200 for 200 years, something that's not repressing infantile desires is exactly the opposite. In Colleen's there's no rootless flower, kind of thing.
Well, do we know anybody that's infantile today in the public domain?
Oh, starts with a T and then a capital R and
yeah,
T rump,
and it starts with a P, and also and also the question is, who was the infantile one, Chris Rock or Will Smith? Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I do have an opinion, and I saw that. I wasn't watching the Oscars, but I went back and saw some highlights, and I went to that because it was in the news.
Right.
And I went, wow, there's even made up fictional theater in the Oscars. That had to be staged, except if it wasn't staged, I'm really surprised.
Well, I don't know that it was staged, because Chris Rock did offend Will Smith's wife, and she was upset about it, clearly. And I don't know if you could stage that, and it would be I would be pretty stupid if I staged an insult of my wife so that I could hit somebody. Right.
Well, that's true. And it's at the same time, it's probably not staged, simply because I know Will Smith and his wife have had some troubles in the last several years. The idyllic marriage was hit by a lot of flack, of his doing, it seemed. And so there was also I'm going to take up for, you don't mess with someone's family, especially their wife. I mean,
that's
unless you want to go ahead and dig your own grave.
That's just inappropriate.
Yeah, it really is.
And I don't know that I would slap them in front of a couple billion people, but at the same time, that's pretty lame to be a comedian and make a joke about somebody's wife.
It is. And I think if it's true, and I think per your point, that's probably a better angle on it of actually what is there. Will Smith is playing the parent, and Chris Rock is playing the pesky adolescent. I'm going to make fun of everything. Nothing's out of bounds. And Will Smith's going, no, you crossed the line,
Yeah, that's right.
to put it mildly.
Right. So, the Academy is going through these motions of what they're going to do about Will Smith. They just gave him the Academy Award as Best Actor. It's really hard to imagine what they can do that will be accepted by the public.
Right.
So why don't you read the second half of this paragraph now from the top of page 149?
Sounds good. Second half of paragraph 236. I have myself seen cases who, in this condition, managed for the first time in their lives to arouse love and even to experience it themselves. Or by daring to leap into the unknown, they get involved in the very fate for which they were suited. I have seen not a few who, taking this condition as final, remained for years in a state of enterprising euphoria. I've often heard such cases referred to as shining examples of analytical therapy. But I must point out that cases of this euphoric and enterprising type are so utterly, I almost misread the next word, are almost, hold on one second, are so utterly lacking in differentiation from the world that nobody can pass them as fundamentally cured. To my way of thinking, they are as much cured as not cured. I have had occasion to follow up the lives of such patients, and it must be owned that many of them showed symptoms of maladjustment, which, if persisted in, gradually leads to the sterility and monotony so characteristic of those who have divested themselves of their egos. Here, too, I am speaking of the borderline cases and not of the less valuable, normal, average folk for whom the question of adaptation is more technical than problematical. If I were more of a therapist than an investigator, love that clarification. If I were more of a therapist than an investigator, I would naturally be unable to check a certain optimism of judgment, because my eyes would then be glued to the number of cures. But my conscience, as an investigator, is concerned not with quantity, but with quality. Nature is aristocratic, and one person of value outweighs 10 lesser ones. My eye followed the valuable people, and from them I learned the dubiousness of the results of a purely personal analysis, and also to understand the reasons for this dubiousness. I love that last section where he's ripping the superficial heart out of psychology and not making it where everyone needs to be cured. He's playing the investigator game. I just love that whole section.
Yeah. On the other hand, let me ask you this question. Do you think that Carl Jung thinks everyone is not cured? Okay. In other words, I've heard of analyses where people have been in analysis for a decade or more. And indeed, Jungian analysts are supposed to have an analyst all the time because they're dealing with other people's psyches. And if they don't have a vent for the crazy stuff that gets poured into their brain by their clients. But do you think that Carl Jung thinks anybody is not worthy of analysis?
I think he would think everyone could benefit from analysis, except I think rather than looking at someone as broken or defective, I think that's why I like that investigator piece more than the analyst piece, because everyone basically has their own conditions. And, I don't think, to amaze Carl Jung in therapy would be you're cured. Then he would say, well, no, you're my analyst. Can I sit with you? I mean, because he had that, he had that kind of selflessness with a very strong ego that was not run over. And it seems like he didn't get starstruck. I think part of that's because, growing up his early career and literally the insane asylums, where it goes to 11 kind of volume every day, and you're basically on the front lines in a war zone of the psyche. But I think that my quote that I use of, always complete, never finished, lifelong, probably comes from my resonance with Carl Jung and that investigator piece where, don't shame yourself. You're always complete right now, but I'm never finished. And that process will endure lifelong.
Right.
But where he wanted people to be able to turn themselves out into their own life. And the cure then was their living and not being tormented. I think self-tormented. So that, back to your question, what I think that Jung thinks that no one is ever cured, I would say yes. I would go on that side and say yes. He doesn't think they're cured, but to qualify that with he probably, and this is putting words in his mouth, which is a little pretentious, just a little, but that there was a threshold, I think, of people having self-creation instead of self-destructiveness, I think is where I would go. And what do you think?
Well, I do think that, he basically would say that everyone can benefit from analysis, even Carl Jung. And he was literally consciously analyzing himself for his whole life. And in the process, he wrote it down, and it certainly benefited me. So I can say that even though I've never had psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, Carl Jung has been my analyst, no doubt. And one of the things he says in the very like the second page of the Red Book, where he talks about the supreme meaning. And he points out to us that all of us are the result of evolution since single-celled organisms. And all of our ancestors have done two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. They all survived until they reproduced. And so each one of us, each human being, is the culmination of 3.5 billion years of development and evolution. Okay, we may have evolved from different groups in various ways, but I think that the number is that Eve, in other words, the first female human being that is related to everybody based on DNA, was only 200,000 years ago. Okay, and before that, there were species before that, but they weren't human. And if we look at 200,000 years, then the 4,000 years since the Abrahamic religions got going is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. It's 2% of the time. And so, we all are related to one another one way or another. As my father used to say, everybody in the Western world is descended from Alexander the Great. Right? And
Genghis Khan. It's like
yeah, and that too. And so, and those are recent ancestors, really. But, where did the Neanderthals go? The Neanderthals are us. Okay.
And it's interesting because when you look at the confluence of apes and then the physiognomy, the structure of the human face and head, Just in terms of the way the brow is formed, the way the jaws work, you can look at the different apes and they have different features. I mean, some have these incredibly kind of sensual, sexy, strong jowls, and some are really thin. And some have this, mono, like an awning of a brow, and then some have partial of each. And it's interesting because sometimes I see people and I'm like, oh yeah, and I don't even think about it. But sometimes I see people and it's like, oh, they look like this. Like, the teeth structure are more, you get more predator or more rodent. I mean, depending, and how balanced are things structured, which is interesting. And not to disparage either of those. It's just kind of, to me, always curious to see the different body types and interpret what kind of animal DNA do they have a similar look to, and is that relation or is that circumstance? And because correlation.
I have some experience with this because, for one thing, I have lived in Japan for 8 years,
right.
And I recently, and I mean by recently, within the last 2 or 3 years, I saw a video of a tribe that comes out of sort of Central Africa, sort of west of Sudan and Somalia, let's say. And it's a very primitive tribe. And by golly, those people look Japanese to me. And amazingly.
Yeah.
And then I've been to Brownsville, Texas, for example, which is right on the border with Mexico. And there are a lot of people of Mexican descent who live there, and they're bilingual, they're Americans, but they all look Japanese to me. And
that's interesting because the Cherokee, a lot of Jews who escaped Europe in World War II assimilated into Cherokee tribes, because the nose structure with the typical crooked bent that's a little enlarged, the Cherokees have the same nose. And it's so, if, Jewish people who would come over and they get enough of a tan and they grow their hair, you think they're Cherokee. And so they're completely hidden in another culture. So yeah, and in Brownsville too. I remember I used to live in South Texas when I was young, and it was in Laredo, which is a little further west. But I would notice when I'm in Brownsville, I'd see people and I'm like, oh, they're Mayan, or oh, they're Aztec, and those people, oh, they're Hispanic. I mean, and there was a difference between which part of South America they had come from, and then even a difference within each type.
So here's an alarming note on the YouTube channel. Justin says, I gotta go at half an hour. My 85-year-old, extremely difficult, extrovert, neurotic mother just had a blood clot in her brain, severely worsening the situation. Biologists today don't think there was a first human. Then he goes on, he says, biologists today don't think there was a first human. We developed gradually through small improvements, and we still do. Yes, I agree with that entirely.
I do.
And
I would do want to say best to his mom.
Yeah. And so I agree with your point, Justin. What I wanted to say about therapy, though, and is that I think that there are various levels of therapy, and we all get therapy in one way or another. We either get it, typically with our male friends in the locker room, or with women with their women friends, typically get it over coffee or tea in the morning. When the husband is gone, the women often get together, and through most of the world, you do see all these coffee shops and tea shops where these old guys are sitting out in front of the coffee shop, and they drink the same cup of coffee all day. Who knows? But they're there, talking or playing backgammon or whatever it is, and or smoking shisha, whatever floats your boat.
You're right there with the therapy too, because when I think people, it's like, people, when you have best friends, and best friends, like best couple friends, and then best single, like individual friends who are a couple or not, or in a couple or not. But there's that, I think that they will call your BS because they know you. And so in that sense, they help you stay on track. If you start going off, they're like, oh yeah, like that'll be the day. That's never going to happen. You never do that. Every time you do that, you do it for like 84 seconds and then you forget it because it's not natural. You shouldn't worry about that. But it's interesting because then, in a sense, they keep you bound to yourself, but they don't keep you from running. They don't keep you from exploring and developing, but I think they keep that perspective. So you're right. Which is a form of therapy. It's just a connection of interaction.
Right. Okay. I'm responding to Justin here. He says he's having to catch a train to go see his mother at 3:30 in the morning in Denmark. And luckily there is a train. And I said, glad you can. Parents need our attention from time to time, especially at the time of death. If your parents are in their last phase, do give them your time. Basically, what I found almost as a rule, because I think normal in the U.S. Insurance companies cover 21 days in the hospital, and in both of my parents' cases, they died exactly 21 days after they were admitted to the hospital. But I said, focus on that. My best 2 weeks with my mother were the last 2 weeks of her life when she revealed family secrets, and we just had we had a ball together. One thing I think that's wonderful in my hometown here, Annapolis, Maryland, is that every room in the hospital is a private room, and every room in the hospital has a love scene which you can pull out and sleep on. And they encourage families to stay with their ill parents or their ill loved ones. And just says family secrets. Ow. Well, these family secrets were kind of interesting. One was there were two real secrets that I never knew, and I was rather surprised that they came out. The first one was that my two grandmothers, who were Victorian women, one of them, to my personal memory, wore a bustle. And they were very conservative. These two women had 5 abortions between them in the 1920s, 5 abortions. And so that's how horrific the world was, because it was illegal then. And about 15% of the medical profession was committing felonies every day because they didn't have birth control of any sort. So that was one. And the second one was that in 1960, my mother voted for JFK, which was quite a surprise to me, because at the time, I thought that my parents were gung-ho for Tricky Dick and
Nixon, right?
And I thought that too when I was 14. What did I know? And obviously I didn't know a lot because then when JFK took office, geez, we loved this guy, and he was amazing, and we loved his inaugural speech, and he kept giving press conferences and making progress on various problems in the country, and so very quickly we loved him, and the amazing thing to me is that when he was murdered in 1963, in November of 63, I was in high school. I was in my senior year of high school in Japan. And it happened to fall. It happened on a Friday in the U.S., but in Japan it was Saturday. And that day, that Saturday, was my senior class dinner. We were planning to have a dinner for the whole senior class, and it was going to be a big thing. It obviously got canceled because of the event. And the thing that amazed me was that when I was on the train and watching the Japanese that day, first of all, they all had newspapers with JFK's picture on it. And many of them were weeping, literally weeping about his death, because many of the Japanese had loved him, and some Japanese had wanted to become an American state at that time. And so that really surprised me. But anyway, my mother voted for JFK. She used to joke that she canceled out my father's vote, but I never really connected that up with the fact that she actually pulled the lever for JFK.
Nice.
And of course, my father was a naval officer, and military people tend to be, speaking the party line, I guess. And he, of course, was favorable toward Ike and the Republican Party because of having been around during the war and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, best of luck, Justin, in your trip. And I
definitely have safe travels, and best to your mom as well.
Yeah. So going on, 237. If through assimilation of the unconscious, we make the mistake of including the collective psyche in the inventory of personal psychic functions, a dissolution of the personality into its paired opposites inevitably follows. Besides the pair of opposites already discussed, megalomania and the sense of inferiority, which are so painfully evident in neurosis, there are many others from which I will single out only the specifically moral pair of opposites, namely good and evil. The specific virtues and vices of humanity are contained in the collective psyche like everything else. One man arrogates collective virtue to himself as his personal merit. Another takes collective vice as his personal guilt, but both are as illusory as the megalomania and the inferiority. Because of the imaginary virtues and the imaginary wickednesses are simply the moral pair of opposites contained in the collective psyche, which have become perceptible or have rendered conscious artificially. How much these paired opposites are contained in the collective psyche is exemplified by primitives. One observer will extol the greatest virtues in them, while another will record the very worst impression of the selfsame tribe. For the primitive, whose personal differentiation is, as we know, only just beginning, both judgments are true because his psyche is essentially collective and therefore, for the most part, unconscious. Now, I just want to stop there for a minute because One of the things that I was reading today was I was reading the Seven Sermons to the Dead in the Red Book, and the point of Jungian psychology is that each of us has to find our individual being, our way of being in the world, and that's not necessarily easy. And so the first sermon of the Sermons to the Dead, and I've read all 7 of them onto this YouTube channel. So if you want to hear them and find them, you can listen to me read them in my Red Book playlist. But the idea is that originally there was the pleroma. Now the pleroma is sort of categories, and it's, as the Gnostics had it, it was 15 pairs of opposites, 30 items, 15 pairs of opposites, so light and dark, good and evil, and 13 others. And the point was that as long as those opposites are in the pleroma, they actually don't exist, but they're qualities in the universe. And so when we differentiate them, then we start to individuate. We start to be, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And then we become our individual selves. And this is the process of individuation, which Dr. Jung discovered and talked about his whole career. And that's what we need to understand. So you don't want to banish the pair of opposites by sending them back to the pleroma, because if they're back in the pleroma, they don't exist. They're just qualities that, they're just qualities that have not manifested, let's say.
You'd make them inaccessible again, basically.
Yeah, you'd make them inaccessible. And the only way you can individuate is to come up out of the pleroma and be yourself. And so what he's talking about here is the fact that primitive tribes, they tend to be more in the pleroma. They haven't differentiated much as yet, and they haven't, they all go with the flow and do whatever the tribe does, that sort of thing. Whereas somebody like me or Jordan, we live our lives quite uniquely. and so what do you say, Jordan?
I'm glad you brought that up, because to me too, and that's not in any way disparaging primitive tribes, but I do think that then, from my personal perspective, that their connection to nature, though, is such an important piece of how they are well adjusted or not ever maladjusted. They don't ever need to know maladjustment and healing, typically. Then they have some that do, but I used to think that most all psychological problems were created by trauma. But then one year I realized that that's too specific. And the reality was, it felt that it was simply nervous system dysregulation. So, for example, if someone goes through a horrendous time, but not because of any particular thing, there's this static, this electricity that's got them with an interference pattern, that it's just shell shock, for example, may not be because of the bombs in the end, it's the overall experience also. And so I find that, looking at primitive tribes for how they interact, and they can be vicious sometimes from our perspective, but sometimes that's just what we would call brutal honesty, which is just a cleaned up word for phrase for vicious, except not necessarily being negative. And so I'm glad you brought up the primitive tribes.
No, they are closer to nature. One thing that I hadn't really understood, as between men and women, for example, a lot of men don't understand this, which is that women are closer to nature than men. And because it's their responsibility to deliver the next generation, and men are not very conscious of that and what the implications of that are. And so women have to work out how they individually are going to deal with the facts of life, let's say, whereas men sort of ignore it. And I remember my mother saying that my great-great-grandfather never saw his wife naked. Never saw her naked.
Which is odd.
She always had something on, and she had like 4 or 5 kids, but but he never saw her naked body. And so men have tried to sublimate nature to be, as far as possible from it. And all of us have, to a certain extent, because that's what the grocery store is. Everything that's in there was once alive, but we don't slaughter the cows and the chickens in the grocery store anymore, or at the butcher shop.
And that creates problems when people aren't aware. I mean, I taught martial arts to underprivileged inner city kids who were given scholarships to come to a university over the summer and to retake their year's courses that they failed, but in a way with teachers that would get them up to A level, by helping them individually and practice. Well, part of it, there's a university garden, and I took them over there and was just to show them. I wanted them to see the lake and to see the garden and be out in nature, because most of them were, chain link, asphalt, concrete buildings, and then buildings. They didn't see a tree or greenery ever, unless it was, kudzu or some kind of ivy or weed growing on a fence. And I remember I picked a carrot out of the ground and I just wiped off all the dirt, and I took a bite. And I said, would anyone else want to get a carrot? And one kid goes, they're dirty. He goes, that's not good. That's not where carrots come from. These are dirty carrots. And I said, well, what do you mean? And I was baffled. I mean, I didn't want to counter him in place. I'm like, I realized I better cross-check my assumptions right now, because I can tell I'm wrong about something. He said, no, that's not where carrots come from. And I said, well, where do they come from? They come from the back of the store in cardboard boxes. I know, because I see my brother bringing them out through those double doors and putting them on the shelf.
Yeah, right.
As if they magically transmogrified just to appear, in the back of the grocery store. But the concept of that something grew in the dirt was, and the concept actually that there was nature, that there were trees. He didn't have that. And I remember the whole summer, there was just this whole inspect what you expect, inspect your expectations, ask more questions, because your assumptions are all off base. And it kind of reminds me of Dr. John Jackson with, the cultural, the evolution of inner imagery based on your culture. And I think I learned more about, their environment affected them thusly, but they were removed from nature.
There's a hilarious episode of bye-bye, Justin. Good luck.
Take care.
There's a hilarious episode of The Gilded Age, which is a 9-episode mini series that's just come out, and we binge watched it in about the last 2 weeks. But I think it may be it's in either in episode 7 or 8. There's this. It's by Julian Fellows, right? Who's the same guy that wrote Downton Abbey. So Debbie and my mother-in-law just love this movie. I like it too because it shows highfalutin women how they were at this point, which is about 1870, 1880 time frame, about the time that Grand Central Station is being built, and electricity is coming into the city of New York, and it's about New York. And then there's this hilarious scene where this woman who's really at the top of society, sub rosa, goes to visit someone else's house. I won't give it all away, but that someone else arrives as she's there, and she has to go out the back door. And so there's this scene where she comes out the door, and there's a guy eviscerating a fish out there with a chopper, and whack, and there's a woman on the other side that's plucking a chicken, and there's all these chicken feathers flying in the air, and this woman is totally flustered by it. It's one of the best scenes I've seen Hollywood produce in a long time.
Nice.
So I'm gonna
have to watch that because I've been looking for a series.
It's called The Gilded Age, and I guess Bridgerton is coming out with the second season also, and we enjoyed that last year also. These things are based on, actual historic events, so it's worth knowing about, although none of our ancestors probably were these people, but it's just incredible to see how stuck up and stupid they were. One of the houses has a woman named Mrs. Van Ryn in it, and she's from old New York, with the name Van.
Right.
She's obviously from the Dutch ancestry. And so, her family had been in New York for probably 250 years at that point. And so the newer people she was trying to hold back, like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts,
right?
Because they were the new group, and
right.
Hilarious. Anyway, I'm halfway through this very long paragraph. Let me see if I can get a little more of it.
Well, really quickly though, I think
sure. Go ahead.
The differentiation of the primitive versus not being differentiated, and then just what the point you made, we were talking about facial structure, and then when I mentioned even within, say, the Mayans, and there are different facial structures within the Mayan facial structure, and you can see other cultures and shapes and forms. But then when you just mentioned, we would say the Rockefellers, and we would say, and we're like, wow, that's old money. And then it was nouveau riche,
they were definitely nouveau riche.
And the others would call them primitive, I mean, so it's interesting. It's interesting how things evolve that way from a historic standpoint. And it just reminds me of Jung putting himself in the 14th century, or, and with no electricity and indoor plumbing, and how that, honestly, how that birthed all this clarity we're reading here, that it sometimes can be abstruse and convoluted and hard to follow, but at the same time, there's just so much meat in it.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yeah.
Definitely.
before we keep going. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So going on, he's still more or less identical with the collective psyche that the primitive he's talking about.
Right.
And for that reason, shares equally in the collective virtues and vices without any personal attribution, without inner contradiction. The contradiction arises only when the personal development of the psyche begins. And when reason discovers the irreconcilable nature of the opposites, the consequence of this discovery is the conflict of repression. We want to be good and therefore must repress evil. And with that, the paradise of the collective psyche comes to an end. Repression of the collective psyche was absolutely necessary for the development of personality. In primitives, development of personality, or more accurately, development of the person, is a question of magical prestige. The figure of the medicine man or chief leads the way. Both make themselves conspicuous by the singularity of their ornaments and their mode of life, expressive of their social roles. The singularity of his outward tokens marks the individual off from the rest, and the segregation is still further enhanced by the possession of special ritual secrets. By these and similar means, the primitive creates around him a shell, which might be called a persona, mask. Mask, as we know, are actually used among primitives in totem ceremonies. For instance, as a means of enhancing or changing the personality. In this way, the outstanding individual is apparently removed from the sphere of the collective psyche, and to the degree that he succeeds in identifying himself with his persona, he actually is removed. The removal means magical prestige. One could easily assert that the impelling motive in this development is the will to power, but that would be to forget that the building up of prestige is always a product of collective compromise. Not only must there be one who wants prestige, there must also be a public seeking somebody on whom to confer prestige. That being so, it would be incorrect to say that a man creates prestige for himself out of his individual will to power. It is, on the contrary, an entirely collective affair, since society as a whole needs the magically effective figure. It uses this need of the will to power in the individual and the will to submit in the mass as a vehicle, and thus brings about the creation of personal prestige. The latter is a phenomenon which, as the history of political institutions shows, is of the utmost importance for the comity of nations. Okay.
Tell me your thoughts, especially the latter is a phenomenon which, as the history of political institutions shows, is of the utmost importance for the comity of nations.
I don't think I had some images coming to mind as I was reading this about my experience in the Marines, where obviously the Marine Corps has a certain prestige, and when you're first at officer candidate school or first at basic training, you're not even allowed to call yourself a Marine until you graduate. And then you can call yourself a Marine, and that is the gathering together of certain power, because even a private in the Marine Corps gets a certain amount of respect from our society. I mean, if you see a Marine walking down the street, even if he's an 18-year-old private, he has a certain aura, a certain respect that anybody who hasn't joined the Marine Corps and been through the training does not have. Okay, it's a gathering together, and it's magical, and you know, I could talk about it till I'm blue in the face, and I could never make you experience it without you experiencing it. In other words, you know, if you know, my fellow Marines and I have a secret sauce that nobody knows, and it's unconscious, I would say. But, you know, nonetheless, you don't want to get into a fight with the Marine Corps. And but I mean, the Marines want you to be a certain thing, which is they want you to be a weapon that belongs to the President of the United States, and so they don't want you to be anything else. And so the classic comment is, if the Marine Corps wanted you to have a wife, Private, we would have issued you one. Right? Right. And so the point is that
or no one here can die without my consent. It's like,
right. And so, you know, in a certain way, you know, I don't know if I can pull it over here without pulling down my whole, well, I can't, but this is not Marine Corps. Hold on a second. Okay, so this is a black Shema that was given to me by Lana Shaheen, my friend Lana, which you may see her at our confluence this summer. And Lana gave me this as a gift back in 2016. When she came here the first time, and she's now been here 4 times. But in that 6 years, I've considered this gift so sacred that I haven't even been able to find a place to put it in my room. So it's always right here, right next to me, within my sight line. I mean, it's actually within my reach. And to me, the gift of it is, you know, numinous, sacred. And it's not that it's a Shema. Okay, when she gave it to me, I have probably 15 Shemas, because at least that many, because I've been to Saudi Arabia 23 times, and I have a full wardrobe of Arabic dress. And I have Arabic dress in Saudi style, in Qatari style, in Oman style, and in Emirates style, and now in Palestinian style. And each one is slightly different. And so for example, you, Jordan, if you were to go and fly into Dubai for the first time in your life, you would see all these guys running around in their Arab dress. You wouldn't have a clue that that their attire is all different.
Right.
But if nowadays, when I go there, I know exactly what nationality these people are, you know, maybe what ethnic group within the nationality that they are, their level of prominence in their society, for example. And some of it is a secret that they won't tell you. You just have to get it. And so, for example, in Saudi Arabia, I finally realized that the royal family people and the people who are very senior wear white shema, typically. Okay. And so I started to take on wearing the white shema just to establish my pecking order in society when I was there. And so that's a magical prestige, right? It's not even saying anything. It's just I'm wearing this headpiece, and what's the meaning of it? And so this summer, when Lana is with us in Helena, I'm intending to wear this in her honor. And it's interesting that just yesterday, I think, the foreign ministers of 4 Arab nations came and met with the foreign minister of Israel. And the primary purpose was to have a common opinion about Iran and what to do about Iran and the Iranian nuclear aspiration. But the 4 Arabs were also pushing Israel, you got to get this Palestinian thing settled. I mean, it's been 70 years.
Yeah.
Right. It's been 75 years now. And, it's just not on to keep it going like this.
Mm-hmm.
And
then that's the Arabs coming in for the comity, COMITY of nations, which is, the mutual benefit of nations, how they work together. And that's kind of that, as you mentioned, like a therapy of a friend, of calling their BS. It's like, okay, guys, you've had your fun for 70 years. This isn't racism. This is juvenile. And it's even worse because it's juvenile. It's racism,
right?
But it's also juvenile, which makes it even worse because this is a whole culture of adults.
Right. And I had an occasion one time to be in Beirut on the 4th of July. It happened to be the 4th of July, 2007, when the London bombing took place in the subway. And on that same trip, I went to Tel Aviv, and it's all the same. Jerusalem is somewhat different because there are ruins there going back 4,000 years, and it's a defensive position. It's up in the mountains, and it
was also the cultural confluence across history. I mean, you've got all kinds of people getting along there. I mean,
for the last 4,000 years. Absolutely. But if you go to Tel Aviv, it's, there's really not a dime's worth of difference between Tel Aviv and Beirut in terms of the buildup of the buildings and that sort of thing, except every so often these juveniles decide to break everything up.
Right.
And we've got to get people to grow up.
Yeah,
I think that's the essence of what Jung is talking here about, growing up. We have to get people to grow up. We see Vladimir Putin doing this infantile attack on Ukraine, which is like a kindergartner who, builds his blocks up and then knocks them all down and says, "Oh, wasn't that fun?" And
I think you're exactly right there with Jung. And so I would even add a couple of words at the end of that paragraph, instead of just importance for the comity of nations, also importance for the comity of imaginations, the imaginations, each of us, what we have within. So that I think there's a I think he's, basically making the point too with comedy of nations. Well, there's so many components inside each of us, so
Mhm.
many states and things and facts and knowings and not knowings. So there's imagination, the imagination. So comedy of imaginations, I think, is there also in by implication here, where I think that is what Jung is doing is for the mutual benefit. The collective unconscious is there for the mutual benefit of all.
Yeah. Well, and in terms of this magic issue here and the prestige of magic, okay, you have situations like this in Russia and in Turkey where the autocrat has built up a palace that's cost $250 million to build. Well, I don't think the White House cost anything like that. Certainly it was built in a different age, but even if you took the costs and put them into 2022 dollars, I don't think, even though the White House has infinite prestige and magic prestige around the world, the Kremlin gets prestige. Yes, the presidential palace in Ankara probably gets prestige for Erdogan, but those are buildings. Those aren't people. So there's a qualitative difference between Erdogan's $250 million palace and a U.S. Marine, okay, and a U.S. Marine, as in comparing the magic of it, okay. Here's a guy that just pulls on his trousers one leg at a time, just like the rest of us, but
right.
But he doesn't have the same, and it's apples and oranges. There's different forms of prestige that one develops. So anyway, let's go on to this next paragraph 238, since it's still on this point.
Okay. Paragraph 238. The importance of personal prestige can hardly be overestimated because the possibility of regressive dissolution in the collective psyche is a very real danger, not only for the outstanding individual, but also for his followers. This possibility is most likely to occur when the goal of prestige, universal recognition, has been reached. The person then becomes a collective truth, and that is always the beginning of the end. Hubris, top of the mountain.
Right.
To gain prestige is a positive achievement, not only for the outstanding individual, but also for the clan. The individual distinguishes himself by individual distinguishes themselves by their deeds, the many by their renunciation of power. So long as this attitude needs to be fought for and defended against hostile influences, the achievement remains positive. But as soon as there are no more obstacles and universal recognition has been attained, prestige loses its positive value and usually becomes a dead letter. A schismatic movement then sets in, and the whole process begins again from the beginning.
Right. So obviously, Putin's prestige is on its way down. The president of the United States has called for his ouster, and
and the White House even backpedaling. I mean, Biden has a habit of going ahead.
But Biden said it, and he backed it again today, saying, I believe this. He needs to go. And do you think that the Kremlin's prestige? I mean, the Kremlin has been there for hundreds of years. It belonged to the czars originally, and so has the Kremlin's prestige been enhanced in any way by this war? even within the Russian people. So let's take it within the Russian people, Jordan. Do you think the Kremlin's prestige is enhanced in any way among the Russian people right now?
I think it depends on their position on the propaganda. Whether the Americans, Biden's statement inflames them or gives them more hope in losing and getting rid of the regime, depending on where they are. And I think the Russians are so much not, they're aware of the Hajj, so to speak, as it were. And I do also see what's interesting is smarter Russians who will look at the whole of the context of that speech. At first, it was, oh my God, Biden went off script and he undermined the whole point of a beautiful speech. And that's what makes him a leader, is that he's actually making statements in advance of what people have put forth in the policy of the position of the party and of the office. So he's actually being a president. And
absolutely,
I found that was that last going off script, this beautifully crafted, teleprompter ready, easy to read brilliance. And then right at the end, he knocked it out of the park, because I think he spoke from the heart. And instead of backpedaling, it was backpedaling until they all came back around to, oh, we don't need to backpedal, we just need to catch up. And
he wasn't talking to the audience that was in front of him, or the global audience.
The world.
He was talking to the Russian people,
mm-hmm.
And because it's within their power, there are a handful of people, let's say 5 to 10, who are close enough to Putin to depose him. Okay,
mm-hmm.
And there's nothing he can do about that. Okay, because he has to sleep like the rest of us, and he has to have people that he trusts absolutely with his life. But when somebody creates an ideation like that, he's not talking to 150 million Russians. He's talking to 5 Russians. Okay. The 5 that can do something about it. Okay.
Right.
And it's an idea that once placed in the psyche will grow legs.
Well, yeah, don't think about an elephant,
Yeah.
I mean, kind of, and that's
right.
that screwed up the next
Right.
3/4 of this day.
Right. And
I'm glad you brought that up just that way too, because what's interesting about the way it's being handled over here and the imago that's being posited over there, it's not calling for an assassination. It's not causing for terror. Deposing, I mean, if we look at it this way, how many previously sitting presidents do we have alive? It's like Carter and
right.
Obama and Clinton and Bush. I mean, so we've got 4. Is Bigger Daddy Bush? He's
dead.
Yeah, he's dead. Yeah, he died. So we have 4, and here's the thing: Gorbachev is still alive and probably rolling in his walking, or but at the difference between him and Putin. But there's an opportunity then to not literally cut the head off, but the deposing part, where it's a civil move rather than a move that causes revenge. Actually, I think, and that to me is in a long-term strategic view, I find a more solid, certainly will take more effort. It takes more learning and development, but I think in the long term, it's a more mature and actually comedy of nations move for the benefit of all. In my opinion,
I mean, someone will step up out of the Russian group, and they will have heard the speech because, the top people will have heard it, and they'll know how to do it. I mean, even a National Geographic history book, this month's edition, which has Anchor Watt in the cover of it, but it's called Nat Geo History. Okay, sorry.
Angkor Wat in Cambodia, right?
Yeah, but in it has the story about how Caesar was murdered, and it goes into great detail. And it happened on a day known to us, which is the Ides of March in 44 BC, and they even had prefigurations about it, where his wife Calpurnia had a dream about him being assassinated, and he too had a presentiment about it, but he still went to the forum and was murdered. And so you can't tell me Nat Geo isn't trying to put the idea into some oligarchs' heads here.
Yeah, that doesn't seem to be just some random history lesson that appeared.
No, not at all.
That's more like them reaching out to the book and still more, tell me why. Oh, well, you may want to know about this.
Well, and it's sometimes true that you cannot divest yourself of prestige. Okay. And so somebody that obviously that it's a president of the United States, even after they leave office, has a certain amount of prestige that follows them. And then the great example, which I love, is Krishnamurti. Now, Krishnamurti was this young Indian boy living on the beaches of then Madras, now Chennai in India. And Annie Besant, who was the founder of the Theosophists, saw him on the beach, and she realized that he had this huge aura around his head. And to understand an aura, if I move my head quickly, you can see that there's this thing that follows me around, that follows my head around. Well, that's sort of an aura, except usually an aura is light in color, like blue or white. And Krishnamurti at age 10 had this huge aura. And so Annie Besant decided that they would pull him in and create him as the new Messiah. Okay, that was the idea. And they sent him, they developed him, they sent him to school, they sent him to Oxford or Cambridge, I think Oxford. And he was extremely well educated. And then on his 33rd birthday, they were going to announce that he was the new Messiah. They had this big international meeting in Holland and Netherlands of the Theosophist Society. And of course, lots of people knew that he was going to be coming out as the new Messiah, even before the announcement. But this was the day when it was going to be official, which was his birthday, his 33rd birthday. And everybody was up on the dais. It was an outdoor, sort of like a revival of the Theosophists, a really big deal. And Annie Besant gets up and announces that he's the new Messiah. And then he gets up and says, I ain't nobody's Messiah.
Yeah.
I'm just a man, who happens to have gotten a good education. And I don't want any followers. And, you shouldn't follow me. I don't know anything better than you do. So, no, I'm not the new Messiah. And the result of that was that he was followed as the new Messiah for the rest of his life. He could never escape it. And I think it was partially because he took this humble position. And obviously he wrote some really brilliant books.
Mm-hmm.
And he was quite a brilliant man in terms of his wisdom and philosophy of life and so on. And so he deserved to have followers, but, he certainly eschewed the idea that he was this Messiah sent from God. Okay. He was definitely a guru, but he was not the new Messiah. And anyway, the result was that he couldn't get rid of the prestige. And in fact, his prestige grew because of that. And he always had an entourage of a couple hundred people following him around, no matter where he went.
Mm-hmm.
And he ultimately came to the U.S. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and the thing that's beautiful about his humility then there was that then he's living the power of love instead of going, oh, I have a love of power. Oh, let me just be all power wielding this and that. And it feels like then, his cross to bear was support from many people. And that's a comedy of nations. And I think that's where Jung here is saying that when at that point, the leader is also good for the tribe.
Well, he did this. Jung did the same thing. Let's see if I can find it here. It's in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, actually, where he eschewed it. He also did it in the Red Book, where he said, I won't be a teacher to you. I give you information about this man. It's not, and you have to find your own way.
And even when he said, I'm glad I'm Carl Jung, so I don't have to be a Jungian.
Yeah, right. Right. Okay, so here's the passage. I did find it terrific. It's amazing how I can pull this stuff out
just right to it
from the books. But okay, so it's on page 355 of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and it's a retrospect. I don't know if I'll read all of it, but I'll read the first part of it because it's sort of the same idea as Krishnamurti. When people say I am wise or a sage, I cannot accept it. A man once dipped a hatful of water from a stream. What did that amount to? I am not that stream. I am at the stream, but I do nothing. Other people are at the same stream, but most of them find they have to do something with it. I do nothing. I never think that I am the one who must see to it that cherries grow on stalks. I stand and behold, admiring what nature can do. There is a fine old story about a student who came to the rabbi and said, in the olden days, there were men who saw the face of God. Why don't they anymore? The rabbi replied, because nowadays, no one can stoop so low. One must stoop a little in order to fetch water from the stream. The difference between most people and myself is that for me, the dividing walls are transparent. That is my peculiarity. Others find these walls so opaque that they see nothing behind them and therefore think nothing is there. But to some extent, I perceive the processes going on in the background, and that gives me an inner certainty. People who see nothing have no certainties and draw no conclusions and do not trust them even if they do. I do not know what started me off perceiving the stream of life, probably the unconscious itself, or perhaps my early dreams. They determined my course from the beginning.
I really love the transparency of the boundaries, the transparency of the walls, where And even further, the architecture, for example, of the White House is an architecture of a different time where,
Yeah.
you'd have a wall that's 3 feet thick, except it's not solid. You can walk in the wall. So every room has a secret way to get there, or a secret way to escape, or a secret way to enter. But walking, Jung's idea of boundaries, their whole lands in the boundaries of transparency, because he sees from here through the transparent wall to something that's beyond.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really astute personal insight he made of himself. And I think it's a quality of a lot of people who are creative. The walls are simply distinctions, but they also have a malleability and a transparency oftentimes but you do understand separateness. And so you don't get lost in the dissolution of just one big infinite room, so to speak, that you roll around in and never gain traction.
And of course, what we're talking about is the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious.
Right.
And crossing that boundary is Jung called the transcendent function. So transcendence and numinosity, which we talk about a lot vis-a-vis religions and so on, it's all about that. It's about getting the connection between the unconscious and the conscious. And so in this essay, we're seeing sort of an early version of Jung. This essay was written in 1915, 16, something like that. So he was 40 years old. He was still very much in the beginnings of his career, which then opened out for decades. But anyway, okay.
Well, and I agree with that boundary too. The line, to me, from my perspective, the line between the conscious and the unconscious is actually not a line, but a whole area, a whole like no man's land between one East Bloc and one West Bloc country. At the same time, I call it the area of the liminal horizon. You don't just cross the line. There's a whole experiential piece, like a bridge between countries. You go through customs. I mean, you do know when you're leaving one and you're in the other, but not to the full on other yet. So I think that's a really important distinction of understanding, again, the transparent boundary between conscious and unconscious that he was speaking of in Memory Streams Reflections.
I think people don't appreciate that it's happening to them. I mean, I now do appreciate it and understand it.
Right.
Because for me, Jung said that when he's confused in a analysis, he waits to see what comes. Well, what comes to me is almost always movie themes or movie scenes, and the scene will come up and it will be delivered to me complete with dialogue. Okay, I'll remember the dialogue exactly, and so this happens to me all the time. I mean, it happened to me with Krishnamurti here as I was talking about it. I was remembering the numinous experience I had reading a book called 100 Years of Krishnamurti, which was issued in honor of his 100th birthday. But it's a profound book. And, but something about what Dr. Jung was saying here about prestige and renunciation of power reminded me of him. It reminded me of Krishnamurti, and then Krishnamurti reminded me back about Jung and what Jung had said when he, said, I'm nothing special. I'm just a guy who did his hat in no water. Everybody else is standing at the same stream. You just don't write it, or you don't realize it. But I mean, I don't know how does it work for you? Because I know that as a tarot reader and as a diviner, you surely have images that come to you that
Mhm.
tell you what to say during a reading.
They do. And what I've found is I finally stopped. What's happened in the last 18 months is I stopped translating them. So the words come as an image, and I don't try to equate and translate. I realized I simply speak, and I started speaking slower is what happened, except in more dense snippets, I'd call them. And I think what happened is I also lost what holds that back. Back when I was an architect, I mean, there was the whole, you're only as good as your last drawing. So don't get all hoity-toity, too big for your britches. But the thing is, what happens is that's a great statement, but it also, in some people, can create performance anxiety. And so what happened is I kind of went back to age 7 when I started, and the cards just told me stories. And I didn't read a book about tarot. And sometimes you'll notice I say tarot or tarot. And I think what it is tarot-key was the game, and tarot are the cards. So I think I unconsciously flip back and forth, but never mind. That's kind of a digression with pronunciation. But I think what happened is I realized the beauty and purity of starting, quote unquote, starting at the level of mastery, simply because it was natural. Just like when a kid says mama or daddy, that's the level of mastery of their language, but it's clear. And so what happened is then I had to have, to me, my notion is that mastery simply leads to further discovery rather than I'm all that. And I think what's systematically happened over the years is I basically personally became more comfortable. And,
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah.
I agree
And
with
I
that.
think, and then what happens there is then that's not weak and wimpy and get rolled over. It's that I'm simply unthreatened. And so I can listen more deeply. And I think that's what happens is a client's question or even their reactions and responses non-verbally to the cards, in a sense, swim as directly in what I say as what I'm going to say. And there's a mixing there, which I think starts to be that capital S self that's starting to, I'm not going to say I'm all that and I'm there, but there's sunbeams through the leaves. And I've started to notice how to read that pattern language. And in that sense, literally going back to reading the visual language without words, but then having an ability to develop the words that resonate with them. And I think that's it right there. It's not I'm expressing meaning and intellect. There's a resonance, almost a sound of the meaning, rather than
you're coming from the Eros side, it seems to me. And so when you start speaking, and I've observed you now for several years, when you start speaking, you do speak from the unconscious, and of course you have a vast erudition because of your upbringing with your parents, and that makes it possible for you to know things way beyond the average high school graduate or college graduate, for that matter, and so you're able to basically, I think you basically hypnotize people.
And I think that's an interesting point. And if so, it's probably a two-way street that we hypnotize together in a way that it's not like Vulcan mind meld kind of thing, but in a way there's a true connection, I think. And it's interesting. I would say, yes, there's a hypnosis piece, but that they and I are both conscious within, and in a sense it creates another world for us to play in. I'm a
mixed emotion about that. I was talking to a pastor the other day, and I said, I can't go to a church service anymore, or any religious service, because as soon as the guru or the pastor starts to speak in their sermon, they put me to sleep instantly. Almost instantly. Within 5 minutes, I'll just go boom, and after evaluating it for quite a while, I realized that they're hypnotizing me. It turns out to be a hypnotic induction. And if you don't know what that is, sports fans, look it up. It's the way a hypnotist brings you into a trance. But basically, they overwhelm your mind. And what happens to me, and it may well happen to you too, Jordan, is that if you go listen to somebody else's sermon, you probably take, and if you can't express out to that person, so you can't have a conversation with them, you're just listening to them speak, probably you take it in very deeply, right?
That's very true.
And you have many different associations with every half sentence that's spoken. And so when that happens, for me, that manifests is I just go,
right.
And,
it's like,
and
wow.
so the question is, am I still taking in the message or not in that hypnotic state? I don't know.
And it's, I don't know either, but I think in a way that, hypnotic induction piece, I find when that occurs to me, you're right. I listen and experience the hearing even more deeply. And I think it's more receptive and more connected. And I take it in more indelibly. And my reading comprehension, so to speak, is up. It reminds me of my thesis advisor, Dr. Jones, and he and his wife at the symphony, and she pokes him in the ribs enough that he hits me in the elbow when he moves, not sitting on the other side of him, and he looks up and he looks at her, and he knows she's poking him because he's sitting there asleep. He fell asleep through one of his favorite pieces, and he starts humming, and he hums the exact bars that he just missed really lightly, where we can hear them, but no one else really can. And he goes, "Honey, Sylvia, I was dreaming about the shrimps and they were playing the flutes." So he had this psychedelic Disney cartoon of these underwater, under the sea, animals playing the instruments, and she said something like, "Honey, violins don't work underwater," and or something like, I don't know what she said, but it was something like, you totally countered him, and he kind of grimaced like, "Okay, you got me." But what's interesting is part of me 100% believed that he was dreaming of the symphony that was playing right in front of him, so that he was almost listening to it from this liminal unconscious state.
Right.
So I don't know.
Well, I've certainly had dreams like that.
And I have to
quite numinous.
Well, and I have to say, your observation about, sometimes when I speak from the unconscious. That, thank you, because I think that's a high honor, because to me, my whole gig is about how natural can something be.
It's not sometimes, Jordan. It is no, it's not. It's
okay.
not,
I'm sick.
No. It's that. You come from the eros side of the equation, not from the logos side. And this is the conversation that I'm having with the pastor, where, she's trying to understand me when I start talking about John 1 through 14. And, I now am at the point where I believe that every word of that is correct and true. Okay, I know it is. It's not a question of belief. I don't believe it because somebody told it to me. And yet, it's a passage that hugely irritated me for many years because, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, I say, no, well, the problem I was having was when they say word in that context, they're not talking about pixels on a screen or black ink on a page. They're talking about something that is both logical, but it has force in it. So
a voice of God kind of level, and that's a both.
But you have to hear it that way. You have to see it that way. And you can't see it that way the way we've been taught in Sunday school. It just doesn't work. But
go ahead.
Well, I mean, I am troubled often by the fact that the churches are emptying out. And Dr. Jung talked about, the gods won't go back if they've ever left a place. They're not going to go back. Well, they're not going to go back with the same stories. Okay. They're not going to go back with this Father God in the sky that's touching Adam on the ceiling of this Sistine Chapel. I mean, that was a nice image at the time that Michelangelo painted it there, but it doesn't work for us anymore. And so we have to help people understand what is it that Michelangelo was talking about there. Okay, what is it? And it's way more than a word. It's way more than can be talked about in multiple books, presumably.
It's interesting because what comes to mind, especially with that Sistine Chapel image, and then you bringing up, my upbringing. My dad was poet laureate of Texas in 2000 to 2002, I believe, and Larry McMurtry, Charlie McMurtry's brother, author of Lonesome Dove, at lunch one day said, Jordan, I pity you, because if your dad wasn't a poet and a teacher and a writer, there's only one other thing he's capable of doing. And I said, what's that? He said, running a military school. And because you want to talk about discipline. And I mean, I remember, I don't know if it was actually ever said, but feeling that, I was being accused of being anti-intellectual. So in a sense, me rebelling against the parents wasn't so much even the parents, it was rebelling against all the academic, intellectual. But the thing is, the good form, the bad form, free verse, iambic pentameter, etc., ad infinitum, ad pleasure, kind of thing. It wasn't ad nauseum. And I think what happened is, you're right, that Eros side coming up is relatively formless, and you have to be careful with that because you'll get lost really.
It's chaos, divine chaos.
And it's like amoebic. It just pours out and there's no form. But what's interesting is then my natural inclination was to become an architect. Well, that's putting both of them together. And I think I'm thankful for, my mom, my dad, and my stepmom, all three providing this intellectual rigor, and also compassion and love and care.
Right.
But I think what happened is it gave me something to hang this nebulous out there stuff on. and then also to lose the structure into the identity of something. Didn't need to have bones, so to speak, but it would have a character.
Yeah.
And that's an evolution. So I'm really thankful for that, because I think, and appreciate your comment that I speak from the unconscious, but it's not just all blah blah blah.
Mhm.
And I think that rigor and that military school of my dad was very much, I think, formative in where I am today, because it gave me a way to not have to not be natural, but I didn't also have to then sit there and mumble in the corner and be the savant drawing freak in the carnival, who couldn't use words and could only draw pictures. I mean,
well, I think you found the right place for yourself, honestly.
Yeah, I think so too. That has a lot to do with it.
Right. And, I'm really proud of you for recognizing that and having put it together in the way you have in the last
Thank you very much.
And a half.
It's short amount of time, really.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me want to come to Taos to see you. But
nice.
Maybe we'll do it in Helena instead.
Sounds good.
We'll see. Anyway, okay. So
we killed 2 hours just like that today.
Yeah. So I'm going to put. I'm going to
put the Confluence.
I'm going to put the Confluence link onto the YouTube channel, and I hope you'll look into that and join us in June. It's going to be a weekend filled with numinosity and synchronicity. You won't believe it. And even we who are doing it won't believe it.
I'm looking forward so much to the alchemy of all the beautiful people that I know that are going to be there, plus the people who I'll meet that are new and are new to me. I look down, I'm like, I need to make those, am I going to drive? Am I going to fly? I mean, it's.
Yeah, well, maybe you don't have to worry about the air tickets quite yet, but you definitely have to make sure you get your lodging covered.
Yeah. I think I might actually drive, because I finally figured out what was wrong with the car, or the oil leak, because when I got stuck at the cabin, it basically shook loose all of the gaskets that were slightly leaking, but not enough to find without taking the engine apart. And so I got it fixed last week. So now
just be careful. It's the Rockies, and well enough about that. But I have a dear friend who's a doctor, and his wife, friends, I should say, and they just retired. They sold off their business and got a 42-foot RV. And at Christmas time, they drove down to Florida, and then they drove over to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. And now they're going to go to Tucson, believe it or not. But they said, but we thought about going back. We're in Carlsbad, New Mexico. I don't know how close that is to you, but I mean, they must have been
a couple hundred miles southern.
Yeah,
the southern side, southeastern Carlsbad Caverns.
They must have been going up for quite some time. I don't know what the elevation is in Carlsbad, but anyway, if you're driving basically a bus up a mountain, it's not necessarily easy. And she said they thought about turning back because it was so difficult to get the bus up into the mountains. And of course, Helena is at 3,500 feet, and Yellowstone is at 5,200 feet up to 11,000 feet. Now, we're not going to be climbing. We're not going to be climbing any mountains, but what was recommended by the locals is that we all travel together in Yellowstone in these two vans that they've rented. They've rented two vans for the duration. And so there are going to be 14 of us on this very special Yellowstone tour, which will include Tim Holmes and some other people.
Nice. And so I just checked. Carlsbad's, I think, 319 miles from me south. And it's at 3,295 feet elevation.
Yeah.
So but they're coming up. If they're going from California, they're coming from zero though. So they're climbing, 4,000 feet.
No, they were coming from Annapolis. So they're at sea level. Coming up from sea level to 3,200 feet is non-trivial.
Yeah.
Unless you're in an airplane.
Well, exactly. And so then I'm in Taos, I'm here at 7,000 square feet. I was 7,000 feet. Right. The thing is, when I'm up at the cabin, I'm at 9,330, like 90, 93 even, 9,300 even. If I'm sitting on the couch and I'll hold the phone with the altimeter right in front of me, it's 93. So but going up 3,300 feet from sea level, that's it. You notice it.
It's half a mile.
Yeah.
In a bus.
In a bus.
Yeah. A big heavy bus. So anyway. Okay, Jordan, I'll see you on Wednesday, I presume. And
see you 1 p.m. your time, 11 mine.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to join the advanced reading group, I guess I should put the link to that. Let's see.
Yeah, good discussion tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, it was kind of fun. Okay, so we have this MailChimp link. And if you want to join any of our events, including our Wednesday morning and afternoon advanced reading group, you can sign up there and get the notices on a regular basis. So I usually manage to get.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up the hypnotic induction tonight, because it gives me something to look at in terms of the epistemology of how
I'll be interested to know what your reaction to it is after you've thought about it a bit.
Yeah, I'm going to let that steep in and look into it, because I used to be really concerned about knowing how I do all this, and now I don't care a lick. But the thing is, I think in the not caring a lick place, I'm more in a place to actually observe and actually find out what I really do. And because I'm not trying to fight it, I'm not trying to prove it. I know it's there, but the different perspectives of coming at it. And so I appreciate, I'll think in, feel into this, and see what comes out of it.
I think that's what you're doing when you're doing a tarot reading as well, which is, once you start talking to somebody, they can't pull away. They want to know how it plays out.
And I've noticed the engagement increasing over the last year. And part of that too is, how many reads am I doing a week? So it's the practice piece of the wheels are greased, so to speak. I'm not just coming cold. And it's interesting to me too. I had someone who was basically perfect pitch, prodigy in violin, but she just so talented and what was going on with her music. And she said, I want you to just speak normally. Let's talk. And let's record it now afterwards. I want you to watch my voice, and I want you to watch your voice. And she mentioned the hypnotic piece simply from a sound. She said, look at this. Your bass and treble are almost the same, and there's just enough treble where we can understand you, but it's this low piece that she said it's mesmerizing sometimes. And she said, I'm glad you actually have integrity. She said, because if you were just a big fat liar, you'd be a great criminal. And I said, but I'm no good at lying very well, so not going to
Yeah.
happen. So, but then she looked at her voice, and it was mostly treble.
Uh-huh.
And she said, you have this male female
Mhm.
thing. And I went, well, I don't have any control over that. But I think what's
Right.
interesting is I look forward to looking into this, because I've also been looking into within Egyptology, the sound stuff that
Mhm,
goes
mhm.
along even more
Yeah.
than I did before. So thanks for tonight.
Okay. Good night, everyone, and
All right.
thank you for being here with us. We still have quite a crew with us, and
Great. Thank you all for being
yeah,
here.
we typically get 250 to 300 views in a week, so it's good group. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We do this on
Definitely.
Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern time, just in case you want to know.